This is an interview with David Robson, a science journalist and author who explores how psychology research can improve the way we think, connect, and live. He's written books including The Law of Connection, The Expectation Effect, and The Intelligence Trap. And in this conversation, we talk about loneliness and health, the liking gap, mindset effects, stress, placebos, and how to tell which studies are actually solid. You can read more about David Robson on our website, 6degrees.blog, as well as our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy this interview.
What habits from mathematics learned before you moved into what habits from mathematics learned before you moved into journalism most shape how you report and reason about science?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the move does seem a bit quite a leap actually to go from something that is very abstract and communicated largely through symbols to something that involves a lot of kind of very basic communication. But actually, I did find that there are a few transferable skills, and I think the main one was that my mathematics degree really taught me how to think and how to kind of sit with difficult problems without descending into kind of anxiety or frustration until the kind of solution kind of emerged for me. And so that it might not be obvious how that would translate to writing, but when I'm trying to structure a big feature or a book, you've got masses of information there, and it's often not clear how you're going to connect it all together in this kind of compelling narrative. And I can feel it's a very kind of tangible feeling that I have that when I'm writing a feature, it feels very similar to when I was solving a maths problem, and that I'll often be sitting there, juggling all of these ideas in my mind, and then suddenly you have that kind of insight where you can just the solution pops into your consciousness. That's a kind of we call that a eureka moment or aha moment in psychology. And yeah, I really think that my training in maths helped with that a lot. More kind of prosaically, um, I did quite a lot of statistics in my mathematics degree, and that is really important for reporting on medical research to understand is a finding significant? Is it robust? How kind of practically important is the effect size of what you're reporting on? So it definitely helped with all of that as well.
And why did you decide to move away from mathematics?
Yeah, I mean, the education system in the UK is quite different from in the US. So we specialize really early on, like even at high school, at the end of high school, we've already only picked kind of four basic subjects that we can study. And that was quite difficult for me because I loved the arts and I also loved the sciences. So I kind of kept up with creative writing while I was at university. And then journalism was just this way of kind of marrying the two, really.
Hmm. So, in the laws of connection, which health effects of social ties are best supported causally versus still correlational? What mechanisms look strongest?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess um, the kind of first chapter is all about the benefits of social connection and how that helps with our helps kind of protect our health and increase our longevity. And so I would say there's a lot of correlational research there, beginning in the 1950s, where you have these longitudinal studies that are tracking thousands of people over, years or even decades of their lives. And then what you can see is that how lonely they feel or how connected they feel at one point um, is associated with a higher risk of death or Alzheimer's disease or cardiovascular disease later on in their life. Now, do have to be kind of skeptical of purely correlational studies, but I'd say even in those cases, one of the important kind of factors that we have is that you can see a kind of time series there. You can see that the loneliness appears before the health effects manage to emerge. So that's already a sign that there might be a causal connection. And so I would differentiate the longitudinal studies from what we call cross-sectional studies, where you're just measuring at a single point in time how lonely do you feel and how ill are you. So I would say, longitudinal studies definitely offer us more evidence than the cross-sectional studies. But then we also have animal experiments. So you have lots of other social animals. And what you find is that you can actually do these causal experiments with those animals without the ethical problems that you would have with experimenting on humans. So you can, isolate animals and see how quickly they develop these different health problems. And that all points towards the same conclusion. You can also do short-term studies with humans. So it's not as good as obviously having two groups of individuals and kind of assigning one to a kind of social condition and one to a loneliness condition over their life. But you can see, in very short term, at the very short term of, hours or days, that you can start to notice differences in physiology when people feel lonely or when they feel socially connected. So changes in blood pressure, for example, that or the uh, stress hormone cortisol or inflammation in the body, all of these things which we know are associated with illness later in life, those chronic diseases. So I'd say it's the combination of all of that evidence that I think provides that strong causal link. And we can see the same with like smoking. You can't actually do the kind of placebo-controlled trials to prove that smoking kills people, but we know that it does because we're looking at all of the other lines of evidence that all point in the same direction. And so I would say exactly the same is happening with loneliness, leading to people suffering from chronic illness and death. It's all the evidence base is similarly growing and robust, and that's why organizations like the World Health Organization are now kind of accepting this as a serious risk factor for disease.
What single cognitive bias most reliably blocks connection in everyday life, and how can people catch it in the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, there's this kind of core bias that I would say then has different manifestations, but it's something called the liking gap. And essentially, it's this idea that we just consistently underestimate how much other people like us. And so this was one of those great causal experiments where scientists got people together in the lab, total strangers, got them to speak together for 5 minutes, 15 minutes, short conversations, and then afterwards they asked each individual within each pair how much they wanted to be friends with the other person, how much they liked the other person, how much they would like to meet up with the other person again. And they also got them to estimate how they thought the other person would respond. And what you saw across the sample was that there was this gap in how people felt themselves compared to how they perceived other people would do. And it was kind of symmetrical. So each person was going away from that conversation really liking the other person, but underestimating how much the other person liked them. And to me, that's a really serious bias because it's kind of quashing any potential connection you might have with someone before you've even had the chance to really start to build it. You had that initial rapport, and then you're going away from that conversation feeling a bit kind of uncertain about the nature of that relationship. And that's going to discourage you from then taking um, like positive action to kind of build a connection in the future. So you're less likely to collaborate with them in a work project or to suggest that you meet up for coffee later on. So to me, it just showed that we actually have a lot more connection around us than we think. But it's kind of literally often within arm's length, and we're just ignoring it because we have this pessimistic bias.
What is one evidence-based microhabit that reliably narrows the liking gap in first meetings?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question. Like, how can we reduce this? So I think actually just having the knowledge of the liking gap can be incredibly useful. Because, like, for me personally, it just helps me to feel a bit more confident about kind of making that kind of second step to building a friendship. So, just saying like, do you fancy meeting for coffee another time? Or just sending that email out of the blue to say, I was thinking of you for this project. I don't know if you'd be interested or not. And, we have to be respectful. Like, we can't guarantee that every single person is going to reciprocate how we feel towards us. But, we also overestimate how rude people are going to be if we ask those questions. And actually, it should be very easy for people to just say, no, I'm too busy. And you have to be respectful of those answers. But what I found is that actually people are much more likely to reciprocate than you think, which is borne out by that research. So I think just, taking the plunge, being a bit more confident can be a really important first step.
Do digital ties deliver the same health and well-being benefits as in-person ties? And do returns diminish quickly diminish?
Um, yeah, so I mean, it's another great question, and the answer is kind of a nuanced, but I think quite optimistic. So, digital ties don't seem to kind of count quite as much as face-to-face conversations. There's something about being physically present with people that helps us to build what we call a shared reality. So, that's just kind of knowing that the other person is thinking and feeling the same things that you are. So you're paying attention to the same things in your environment. If you're having a meal, you're both enjoying the food together. And we know that that's really fundamental for a sense of connection. And, we also know that touch is really important in human connection. So we actually have special nerves that can feel social touch, as we call it. So, a pat on the arm or giving someone a hug, all of that can be really important for connection. But that doesn't mean that the digital remote connection isn't also important and valuable. It's just not quite as effective. So I would say um, face to face is best. Video is next best because you still have the non-verbal elements like your facial expressions and body language. Then phone or audio is great because you can at least hear the intonation in the voice. But even something as simple as sending a text to someone can have an effect on them and you. So both of you are going to feel a bit more connected and feel this kind of warm buzz from having had that short interaction. And so I think in a lot of the discourse that we see in the media about kind of technology creating a loneliness epidemic, well, I think there are valid concerns. I think we shouldn't discount the fact that technology can really help us build connection. And we can see that, families today compared to a century ago, I think are much more likely to be spread across a country or across the globe even. But it's amazing now that you can still have those video calls with your family members where you can see their facial expression. You can share those important moments, even if they're thousands of miles away.
In the expectations effect, what is the cleanest study that changed your own mind about expectations reshaping physiology?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to choose from. And again, with that, I would say it's kind of the wealth of evidence that I think was more convincing than any single study. But if I had to pick a study that I think was very eye-catching and made me want to follow this up more, it was this famous study from Harvard University where Alia Crum and her colleagues um, took about 80 hotel cleaners from, I think it was 7 different hotels. And for half of those staff, so for half of the hotels, so I think it was 4 of the hotels, they gave them information about the kind of potential health benefits of doing their work. And the fact is that, we don't often think of like, cleaning rooms like vacuuming the carpet, cleaning windows, lifting furniture. We don't think of that as a workout, but the when you look at the physiological output of doing that, so how much it's raising your heart rate and how many calories you're burning, it's absolutely significant. Like you're getting quite a lot of exercise from doing that work. And what she did was just explain to those cleaners this simple fact that their work could count as exercise. She gave them a presentation and left kind of posters and flyers around for them to learn more. And about a month later, she went back and she tested those people, on their kind of physiological parameters like their blood pressure, for example, or how much they weighed. And what she saw was that there were some improvements simply from having given them that information. Now, she tried to account for other facts, other potential explanations. So she asked them, have you been doing more exercise over this period? Maybe they just felt really enthusiastic about, their bodies in general and then had started working out more at the gym. But they didn't seem to have done that. They didn't seem to have changed their diet. Nothing seemed to have changed apart from their mindset. And so that was about 18 years ago, that study. And we've seen a lot more evidence since then showing that mindset really can shape our health. But I think that was the one that really caught my attention to start with and made me want to know more about this. It's essentially what Ali Akram was showing was that the placebo effect, which we have studied in medicine for decades, also applies outside of the hospital or doctor's surgery and really can influence, health outcomes with exercise or diet or sleep. And so that was what the expectation effect is all about, is interrogating that research and asking, you know, how can we harness this expectation effect? And there's now so much work. I think I cite about 400 papers in my book, and it's that wealth of evidence that I think is really convincing.
So this sort of reminds me of people like Joe Dispenza and things like that, where people speak about how your mindset can influence both yourself and sort of your surroundings. Do you believe in manifestation and things like that?
No, not. I mean, so I don't really. I mean, I think there's like a nugget of truth in there that I think is the kind of science of the expectation effect. But then I think it can also be um, misapplied. So, like books like The Secret talk of this kind of cosmic law of attraction, where you think like I want riches to come into my life, and then somehow that's sending out, I don't know, like good energy into the universe that's going to bring money into your bank account. Like, I don't believe in that at all. I think that's totally pseudoscientific. But what I think the research on the expectation effect shows us is that there are some plausible mechanisms by which your beliefs can become self-fulfilling prophecies, and that is through changes to your behavior. So we see that with aging, for example, people who um, are more optimistic about getting old and see, their retirement as a time of opportunity, they're more likely to exercise and to have a healthier diet. So they kind of make this a reality that they're actually going to have a better retirement and be healthier for longer through the behavior that they're enacting. Then we have a direct physiological response. And again, if we look at aging, if you are quite optimistic about getting old, you are going to feel less vulnerable than someone who is expecting to start developing diseases and to become more vulnerable and dependent on other people. And that feeling of vulnerability, day to day, it's not going to have a huge health effect. But over time, it's going to raise things like levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, inflammation in the body, so inflammation is um, linked to a whole host of diseases like Alzheimer's disease or heart disease. And adds up over time. So year after year after year, if you've got elevated inflammation and elevated cortisol, you're just more prone to get chronic diseases. And finally, there's just our perceptions. How where your expectations can shape things like how we perceive pain. Um, and that's through the brain's processing without any kind of effect on the body, but it's just to do with things like how much the brain can, how much it releases certain neurotransmitters that can amplify pain or reduce pain.
Hmm. So the reason I ask is because I have a friend's parent who's super successful, worth like multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, and they're a big fan of these sorts of manifestation things, and they're preaching this. And I've always rationalized it very similarly to the expectation effect, where it's sort of if you believe you will be successful, then that changes your work ethic and that changes your level of confidence and whatnot. Not necessarily that there's going to be success being thrown at you because you sort of put these energies out into the environment. So it's quite
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's totally how I see it in that particular context. If we have this concept in psychology called self-efficacy, which is kind of whether you believe you're capable of doing something. And people who have higher self-efficacy, they're just more likely to put in that work that you mentioned and to take new opportunities. So, whereas someone with low self-efficacy might look at a job that's been advertised and not even bother to apply because they just don't think they're going to do well at the interview. Someone with high self-efficacy is more likely to take that opportunity to prepare well and then kind of kill it in the interview. So, for all of those reasons, yeah, I do believe that manifestation can work for some people, but I really think we have to be aware of the limits of that too, because I think where it gets dangerous is where you're telling people who have terminal illnesses, say that they can cure their cancer just with the power of the mind. And that's like absolutely not the message of the expectation effect, because we have to look at the research for what is and isn't possible, and there have to be really plausible biological mechanisms to explain why your beliefs would cause, whatever effect you're talking about.
Hmm. So reframing stress as energizing can boost performance. So what guardrails prevent that from sliding into toxic positivity?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's all about moderation, actually, here. Um, so first of all, I'd say primarily changing your stress mindset, I think is really useful for those situations where you've kind of chosen to be in you've chosen to face a challenge. That's how I would put it. So, you've applied for a job and you've chosen to go to that interview because you really want the job. So there's a positive reason. But, when you get to the interview, you start feeling nervous, your heart starts racing, your mouth goes dry, your palms are sweating. And in those situations, or, if it's a difficult exam, like all of this has been shown in the literature, in those situations, if you try to see your stress as being energizing, that can be really beneficial to your performance and also to some of the physiological measures that you would have of the stress response in and after the event. And I think a lot of people, like when I speak about this at talks and or giving interviews, I think a lot of people can understand that actually, that it's just reappraising what you're feeling. It's easy for us to start when we can feel the stress response kicking in. We kind of get into a panic about that. We think it's actually a sign of failure and poor performance. And all this is saying is that actually we evolved this stress response to help us to deal with challenges. So it's just appreciating that, as uncomfortable as it may be, you don't have to love your heart racing or your palm sweating, but it's recognizing that those are symptoms of something that's positive that's happening in your body because you're getting more blood going to your brain to energize your performance. So I think, in those contained situations, I think that's pretty healthy for you to be able to reappraise in that way, and the research supports that. And I think toxic positivity is when we try to have this kind of Pollyanna-ish rose-tinted view of everything that's happening in our life without recognizing the external challenges that we have that we might need to change or we might need to push to be changed, or to try to force yourself to remain cheerful when you're facing something terrible like grief. What the research shows in those situations is that we're actually better not trying to change the way we're feeling immediately or to suppress those emotions. Sometimes we just have to let the emotions come, kind of accept them, treat ourselves with self-compassion, and reach out and get the help that we need. So the expectation effect would never be um, an alternative to going to see a counselor or getting therapy or taking medications if you need them. So yeah, those are the kind of distinctions I make when I'm trying to explain the expectation effect, is that, we need to be careful that we're still getting all the other support that we can need. And then in these situations, like we can use reappraisal and tools like that to improve our experience.
Mhm. That reminds me quite a bit of things like that Mike Tyson would say about reframing fear and stress and whatnot. But how would you mitigate stress other than obviously connecting with other people? How would you mitigate stress in all areas of your life?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there's a few kind of mindset shifts that I would kind of encourage. So like if I'm giving kind of a public speech, I would like when I'm preparing for that, I would like, kind of as soon as I start feeling that stress response, like as soon as it comes, I would start telling myself, this is just reminding myself of the science essentially, just telling myself like, this is not a negative thing, this can be a positive thing. It can boost your performance, just remembering all of those physiological benefits of feeling stress. And this is exactly what happened in the research. So they basically, when these students were taking graduate records examinations, which are like incredibly difficult, they'd just read like this really short text just explaining how this stress response can be helpful in certain situations, and that really did um, improve their performance and also helped to change things like like how quickly they recovered after the event. So just knowledge again can be really helpful. But I think like there are lots of other ways that we can regulate our emotions that we we can also recognize so practical um, uh, kind of steps that we can do, like that we don't necessarily that we don't necessarily like appreciate, and what works for each person will be individual. But things like changing your environment. So sometimes um, there's really robust research showing that going out into nature, if you have it nearby, can really help to reduce your stress response in the moment. So if I'm getting stressed about writing an article, I'll try to go and work in my garden, for example. Small things like that. Yeah, talking to someone is obviously really helpful. Listening to music, basic self-care as well, I think is essential. And sometimes just recognizing that stress is uncomfortable but useful for growth, that can be really helpful. So that's a kind of more kind of global mindset shift, I would say. But it's recognizing why you're doing what you're doing, how it aligns with your values, and then kind of just acknowledging the fact that you're feeling the discomfort, but that it's there for a purpose. All of that can psychologically be very helpful for us.
Hmm. So these work great for short-term things like a test or public speech. But what about, let's say I have a stressful 3 months coming up or something like that. How would you handle that?
Yeah, so I'd say first of all, like repeating these things like day after day can actually be super powerful. So it's a bit like James Clear talks about like atomic habits. So actually, I think there are incremental benefits to doing all of these things because what you're doing is preventing the stress from accumulating over that period. And I mean, that's why when I was speaking about the kind of mindset shift for stress, so reframing stress, that's why the quicker recovery is so crucial, actually, because essentially what you're doing there is, your body might go into something close to the fight or flight mode. But then if it can get out of that afterwards, like that's much better for your body to be able to go into this rest and digest mode where it can start maintaining your tissues and doing all of those other functions that are kind of ignored when you're stressed. So, say you've got a difficult day at work, and then in the evening, you are able to wind down and relax because you've had this mindset shift. That's so much healthier than if you're really wired while you're at work, and then you're also wired in the evening and you can't sleep because of that. And you're doing that day after day after day. You're much more likely to suffer from burnout when the stress is prolonged in that way and you're not having any of these recovery periods. So I would say absolutely, that's why I think we can often neglect because sometimes the effect in the moment won't be as profound as you would want, but it's actually when you look at the cumulative effects that it's really impressive and it's like your trajectory that I always try to emphasize. So even if you're um you might say you're repeating the same kind of stressful task every day, like you do your reframing on the first day, it might improve your performance a little bit, but you can kind of build on that day after day after day so that your performance increases a lot in the long term. So yeah, I think that's what I would suggest. And it would just be also um, the practical steps of just like reaching out to people, getting the support that you need, trying to practice things like mindfulness if that works for you, looking for all of those other stress relievers. But in terms of the expectation effect, I think, yeah, perseverance is what's key, really.
Hmm. So just this is sort of besides the point, but just as a testament to stress's negative effects, I got a little fitness watch
Yeah,
thing about a week ago. And these past 4 days, or like a few weeks ago, these past 4 days have been very, I've had a bunch of tests and quizzes, and I've had interviews, and I'm working on this paper. And you see so when you're stressed, your sleep gets a little worse, and you don't go to the gym and whatnot. So it sort of accumulates, as I'm sure you know. And it was super profound and I just noticed this maybe yesterday, how my resting heart rate would go up after even just 2 days of being stressed. Resting heart rate goes up by 20%, and my heart rate variability is all out of whack. And
yeah.
it's something sort of crazy that I noticed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so yeah, like I've got this, like my Apple Watch does the same. And yeah, it can be quite alarming. Like you say, like a 20% increase in your resting heart rate feels quite serious. Uh, Yeah, I mean, so I guess I think it's great actually tracking those things and then trying to notice, like, and if my heart rate variability has been like super high, I mean super low for a few days, like I really do try to change my routine, like responding to that. So, um, I would try to kind of drop one of my other responsibilities maybe or like sometimes I'm pushing myself too hard at the gym or whatever, and then like when you notice that your heart rate variability is kind of low continuously for a few days, then um I'll just like drop out of going to the gym and recognize, you have to prioritize sometimes the things that matter most, and just, try to take that time out of your schedule to have a kind of deep relax where you're not actually striving towards anything, when you're just allowing your body to recover. So that would be my advice. I think also, we neglect like the importance of things like traits like conscientiousness and planning. But that absolutely, like all of those metacognitive skills that we have to to kind of set up a good plan for how we're going to juggle all of these things and trying to stick to that, that can actually make the whole stress that we're facing feel so much more manageable. So that helps in the short term and the long term, essentially.
Hmm. So open label placebos sound paradoxical. So when do they work and when do they risk undermining trust?
Yeah. So like the placebo effect obviously has been like this real frustration for doctors for centuries, in that they know that expectations can often influence the outcomes of a treatment, and especially things like pain, which is not to be neglected, since it's one of the most common reasons that people are going to hospitals, staying in hospitals, puts people at risk of opioid addiction. For all of these reasons, something like pain is really important for us doctors to manage. And the frustration had always been, we know that placebos work, but how can we give them to patients ethically? Because you can't lie to a patient and tell them they're taking an active treatment when when the doctor knows that it's not an active drug. Now, open label placebos actually help to solve this problem. And that's why they are causing so much excitement, because there's no deception there. You're giving the pills to a doctor, to a patient, and just saying to them, take these pills. They're placebo pills, but they'll still help you. And then you explain to them the expectation effect, the power of the mind-body connection, the physiology of that. So explaining how when you're expecting to feel better, you release more opioids in your brain, for example, so endogenous opioids that are produced by your brain, which can have the same effect as those opioid drugs. So you're explaining all of this to the patient. And what the research shows is, kind of quite remarkably, that they do work. Like, even though the patient knows they're not taking a real pill, they still show a clinically significant reduction in their pain. Um, Now, you can boost that sometimes by using a process called conditioning. So it's very much like, Pavlov's dogs, where he rang the bell, gave them their food, and then they would start salivating just when they heard the bell. Well, what the scientists have found is that if you give an open label placebo alongside the real pill, um, it kind of boosts the effects of the placebo effect when you take away the real pill, because there's been this stronger association between that particular pill and its taste or smell and pain relief, essentially. So that is, there are lots of ways now that it seems like it can be harnessed. There have been some really promising results with people suffering from chronic pain, for example. So one study, in the short term, it found that the benefits were clinically significant over about a week or so. But even more encouragingly, when they followed up on those patients 5 years later, they found that they had also kind of learned how to manage their condition better without taking more medications. And it seems to be that they almost, even if they weren't actively taking the open label placebos by that point, they had realized how their mindset was shaping the pain. And so they were using that to their advantage. So I don't personally think that open label placebos will erode trust. I think we just need to work out the best way to educate patients about them, to roll them out, to make sure that everyone's really understanding what's happening before they go home and take these pills.
Hmm. From the intelligence trap, what is a case where expertise amplified error and one simple check would have prevented it?
Mm, yeah. I mean, my kind of favorite example of this that has been really well studied comes from Philip Tetlock's work. So he has, for the last, like, I don't know, 40 years been studying political forecasting. So looking at these pundits who you'd see on TV or who write columns for newspapers and getting them to kind of, give specific predictions about the course of political events or global events. And what, he famously said that, at the end of these studies, what he found was that often these pundits were performing worse than chance. So he said you might as well have had a chimp throwing darts at a dartboard to come up with the predictions because they would have done better than these pundits. And he then looked at, did like linguistic analyses of like how these pundits were talking about these specific issues. And what he found was that there was often a lot of dogmatism in what they were saying. So they were kind of trusting their expertise too much. They'd come up with their kind of theory of what was going to happen, and then they were sticking to it dogmatically without updating their um, their kind of knowledge. And it's actually there's a lot of psychological research on how we can avoid that. But the single best thing we can do is just to remain really curious and to make sure that we're constantly viewing new information with an open mind. So not just kind of reflexively dismissing it without considering it rationally. And there are some psychological techniques we can use to do that. One of my favorite is a strategy called consider the opposite, which is just if you take a document, like some evidence that you either agree with or disagree with, before you start kind of justifying why it's right or wrong, you start to question like, how would I analyze this document if it said the exact opposite of what it did? So, the basis of the evidence. If you're looking at a survey, things like the sample size that you might criticize or the way it's been conducted, So what the consider the opposite technique is getting you to do is to just recognize how you might be jumping to all of these conclusions prematurely and to try to preempt that before you make a judgment. And the research has shown that that can be really effective in all kinds of um, areas of judgment and decision making. So it protects us against a whole load of biases. And as a rule of thumb, it's just a super quick way of um, of making a wiser judgment.
Hmm. So I was speaking to Paul Seabright, who's a economist, but he does sociology things, and he's actually British himself as well.
Yeah.
And he was saying how a similar thing, but he was saying how it also works systemically, where you just trust an organization is correct, and that's just how it is, and then
Yeah.
eventually it crumbles down. He paralleled that to he was in Venezuela and he leaned on a guardrail because in America guardrails tend to be trusty, but then he fell off and broke his arm. So that's
Yeah.
quite interesting how it sort of parallels between humans and larger things.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that is like one of the main things that when people are suffering from this kind of confirmation bias, it is that kind of, well, it came from, like you just assume, well, it came from this organization, so it must be right, or it must be wrong because it came from this news organization. And we we should be looking at the details of what it's saying rather than making that prejudgment, essentially.
Hmm. How can organizations curb elite overconfidence without slowing decisions to a crawl?
Yeah, I mean that I actually have a lot of sympathy for a lot of these kind of bigger organizations that they want results quickly. They don't want to kind of install even more processes before coming up with approving a new product, for example, or service. But there are some strategies that they can build in. And I think, fundamentally, it's the most important thing is just changing the organizational culture where, um, uh, like, I want to say whistleblowing, and I guess it is whistleblowing, but like where reporting errors or failures or doubts is something that can be appreciated and celebrated rather than um, kind of frowned upon. So you mentioned toxic positivity earlier, and there's this researcher called Andre Spicer in London who he's looked at the effects of toxic positivity in lots of organizations, like the kind of workplaces where you're told like don't bring me a problem, just bring me a solution, all of that kind of thing. And he's found it's really bad for decision making because people start hiding their errors or deliberately ignoring something that might go wrong just because they are too scared to actually give negative feedback about anything. And so errors accumulate really quickly. And we saw that with the Deepwater Horizon disaster. That, there were multiple signs that, there was danger of an explosion, that gas was kind of leaking and building up. But no one wanted to kind of take responsibility for raising that issue. And so there were quite a few near misses. And then finally, the gas was leaking at just the moment when there was another spark that caused the explosion and the disaster. And some organizations are just much better at preventing that by encouraging their employees to report mistakes as soon as they happen.
Hmm. That reminds me of I mean often it seems like it could be such a drastic change just to implement a few safety procedures. But I was speaking to Michael Moss last week, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he got his prize over an article about this woman who ate a burger. She was a dance teacher and she ate it's sort of the one sentence sounds like a stretch of the imagination, but she ate a burger and that ended up leading to her being paralyzed and thus not being
Oh
able to
God.
do her
Yeah.
job anymore. But the moral of that story was not just, oh, these meat companies are not paying attention to what what bad things could be in their products, but actually that Costco, of all things, was just implementing a few very simple, very small safety procedures that almost completely eradicates any risk of being paralyzed in this case. Um,
Yeah.
so it seems like you can just do very simple things and it can change your if you weigh the risk, small things could uh, fade away drastic consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was what I really learned with this research on like Deepwater Horizon and other kind of huge disasters, was that it really was often the small things that people were overlooking. And we saw that with like Challenger and Columbia, those disasters too. And so there was one particular bias that was really relevant there, and it's called the hindsight bias. And no, not the hindsight bias. It's like uh I can't. It's like the kind of like the near miss bias. Anyway, the problem is that when it's like you judge. Oh, the outcome bias. That's it. Because you judge something by the outcome, not the process. And often that can mean that if there was a near miss, so if there's gas leaking but it doesn't cause an explosion, you just assume that it's not going to be a problem in the future. And the more it happens, the more complacent you get about that. You just think it's one of those things that won't cause, there won't be a problem that you don't need to think about. So your kind of risk assessment actually becomes less over time when it should be growing. You should be more concerned the more often you see it, and that's what happens in all of these disasters. And uh, to overcome that, I think like you really do need to recognize the kind of balance of probabilities here, which is, it's a bit like playing roulette, it's like you can have like nine near misses, but then it's like the 10th bullet that's going to kill you. And it's the same in these organizations. It's actually just fixing like a gas leak would be have saved so much problems on Deepwater Horizon, but people were becoming complacent the more it happened, which is like it's the most irrational response to that. So there is then that research showing that when you encourage employees to report everything that they see, and they're not going to be accused of time wasting for reporting some things that may like legitimately be inconsequential. When you encourage that and have a system in place, that's when you avoid those big disasters.
Hmm. How do our expectations about other people change social outcomes? And where do expectation effects and connection effects most powerfully interact?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I think there's a few that spring to mind. I mean, I think we have one expectation effect around solitude, actually, which it might sound counterintuitive because with the laws of connection, I'm really promoting kind of social interaction. But we're all, no matter how sociable and gregarious we are, we're all going to have some periods where we feel lonely. You know, you've just moved to a new city, or your family have kind of gone away for Christmas and you're left on your own. And in those periods, our expectations and kind of the meaning we assign to solitude can really shape the outcome for how we feel by the end of it, whether its impact on our mental health. And so we can either view solitude as being this kind of huge disaster, or we can see it as this opportunity to kind of reflect and to take stock and to recognize that sometimes, when it's limited, it can actually have benefits. And the research is by Ethan Cross, who's at the University of Michigan. And he's done some great researching. That's it's really significant actually for people's overall, um, mental health during those difficult periods. And I think there's an added advantage here that one of the problems with loneliness is that it can sometimes kind of become self-perpetuating. So the more lonely you feel, the harder you find it to make new connections. And so it then that kind of prevents you from going out and meeting people. And when you do, you feel so shy, you're not really in the moment and connecting in the right way. And so, like Olivia Lang describes that really beautifully in her book, The Lonely City. But if you're taking that moment of solitude, that week of solitude, and you're recognizing that a bit like with stress, you're recognizing that it has its difficulties, but it also maybe has its benefits for you, then actually when you come out of that, you're probably much more likely to be in a psychological place where you can connect more easily. So I think, and it's very similar actually to all of the other expectation effects that I spoke about, that it's allowing you then to kind of get back on your feet and to recover more quickly. But I think, in terms of like, basic everyday interactions, we have a load of kind of biased expectations. So when we're looking to, when we're in difficulty and we need to seek help from other people, we tend to assume that the response to our request is going to be a lot ruder than it really is, or a lot more negative, or just that we're going to have to ask a lot more people. But there's some really good research by Vanessa Bones, which has shown that actually people are about, on average, across loads of different situations, people are about twice as likely to help you as you estimate. So, you look at charity workers or people who are trying to kind of raise money for their kind of charity run. And what you find is that actually they need to ask about half as many people to raise the money as they would expect. Or, your phone's out of battery, you need to um, and you need to call someone urgently, like you might feel so shy you don't ask anyone if you can borrow their phone, but actually you only need to ask two or three people before someone lends you their phone for you to make the call. And I think that's really profound actually, because so many of us will go through those moments where we're really struggling and again, the support that we need is probably very close at hand, and we're just too shy to ask for it. But we shouldn't be. We have to show respect to those people. We have to kind of accept um, a denial, very graciously. But the fact is, people are much nicer, much more positive than we expect them to be. And actually, just shifting that expectation and going out there, it will help you to develop a much more positive view of the world.
So this sort of positive feedback loop reminds me almost like if you were to pierce your ears or wear a pink t-shirt and you go outside for the first time right after it happens, you expect somebody might come up to you and say, "Oh my gosh, your ear's so ugly," or your shirt is so
Right.
flamboyant or something like that. Except your 100th time, nothing happens. And also within asking for help and people being so willing to help. I've definitely personally I've seen that in an incredible way where I used to be much more not willing to ask people, oh, could you do an interview or something like that. But once you push through the first few times and you start seeing that people are so willing to help and are so willing to help mentor you or write a letter recommendation or give an internship or something like that or in interviews like this, then it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling thing where you are more willing to put yourself out there and get the help that you'd want from these people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a really important life skill to learn, I think. So, and going back to what you were saying before about, like if you wear this really loud t-shirt, people just don't care as much as you think. I mean, there was an actual study looking at that where they got these students to wear like Barry Manilow t-shirts in like the school canteen, and they vastly overestimated how many people even noticed it. Like, no one's paying attention, and if they do, they don't really care what you're wearing. Which is actually, I found that to be quite helpful. It's quite disinhibiting in a way because it helps you to realize that any of those small faux pas that you make in conversation, the other person's probably not going to remember it. And even if they do, they're going to forgive you much more. They're much more likely to forgive you than you think they are. Regarding your second point, I think, and about how this is this kind of skill that, the more you do it, the better you get at it. That's exactly what the research shows. So our social skills are kind of like muscles, and all of those negative expectations that we have, they evaporate quite quickly once you have that positive feedback when you're doing the thing that you've been scared of, and then you see that it's not as scary as you thought it was going to be. There was a study by Gillian Sandstrom here in the UK where she created this kind of app for her participants, where they had to go on this kind of treasure hunt almost, where she's just encouraging them to talk to at least one new person each day. Um, and it's like it gave them kind of goals, like talk to someone with a cute pet or who's doing art in public or who's got really great hair. And, to start with, they all had this negative expectation that it was going to be really cringeworthy to make small talk to a total stranger. And it took just 5 days for them to break through that negative expectation and to feel much more comfortable with those interactions. 5 days is kind of incredibly short when you're looking at behavioral change. And when you think of all the situations that can help us with. So, it makes things like networking with work so much less daunting, when if you're starting at a new school or college or, in a new job, like it just makes that first day so much more comfortable if you have that expectation that those interactions are going to be good. And it takes just 5 days to kind of to get to that point if you do it regularly.
Mhm. Yeah, I've definitely seen that in my own life where I'd say I'm probably pretty introverted, but I speak to all kinds of people all the time.
Yeah.
And wherever at the gym, school, and whatnot. And it's very, at the start, you have to make a huge effort. And even, I mean, as down the line, you have to make a huge effort to even say, oh, could you turn on the timer or something like that.
Yeah.
Except as you go on, you realize that there's a huge discrepancy between your expectations and reality in the way that if you ask somebody to turn on the timer, they're not going to say, "Oh, well, why don't you just turn it on yourself and like slap you in the face or something like that." But they're just going to
Right.
be like, "Okay, yeah, for sure, I'll turn it on." And I also think in terms of judgment, when you look at yourself and you look at what you expect of other people, for example, in Houston, a lot of people are very conservative in like how they dress and things like that. But I was in Austin recently for a music festival. And I'd say I'm a very average person in terms of things like this. And there were all these people. In Austin's much more liberal, and they go kind of crazy city. And there was all these people in these crazy outfits and like drag queen, this and that. And me I'm not super anything. I look at them and I notice them. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool or something like that. But I'm not overly judgmental or overly noticing anything. And if I was in their outfit, I would probably be thinking, oh my gosh, these people are all judging me so much. Except I think there's a huge difference between what you expect others to think of you and what even you think of others. I mean, you can just level that and see that there's a large difference between reality and your expectations.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really good mental tool actually for you to use. Is to just think like, when you have that kind of apprehension about how you're going to be perceived, just think, well, um how would I perceive someone who had done that? And there have been experiments of this. So, like when you kind of do something that's a bit embarrassing. So, like, like you forget to kind of get the electronic tags with your like library books kind of deactivated, so the alarm goes off in the library, or you turn up at a party and everyone else has brought food and drink and you're empty-handed. And so they got these people to estimate, how would you react to someone who had done that? And most people are like, oh, it's fine, like it's not a big problem at all. And then they're like, well, how would you expect other people to judge? And on average, people were like, they assumed that other people were going to judge them twice as harshly as they would judge the same person, someone for the same act. And so I think this just gives us a lot of confidence actually um, to just kind of turn down the dial a little bit on our apprehension and just recognize that, okay, I feel a bit embarrassed, but it really like almost certainly isn't as bad as I think it's going to be.
Mhm. Definitely. And I know I keep saying I was speaking to somebody, except I was speaking to Robin Hanson, who does all kinds of things with aliens and um polymark like these prediction markets and whatnot. And what he is a sort of very cynical point of view, and he has a book where he looks at, I'm forgetting the name of the book, where he looks at 10 different hidden motives. It's all about hidden motives. And what he was saying is the opposite of this, which I'm not a huge fan of that idea, where it's sort of he's too kind in terms of what he thinks he would. So he looks at other people and sees their hidden motives and see how evil they are. And he says, oh, he looks introspectively and says, I'm probably not so different from other people. So I'm actually going to bring myself down to this level of evil that I don't really recognize because I think of myself too positively. So I like this idea that we're discussing much better than that sort of cynical negative perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't read his work, but I would say the kind of research I've looked into for the laws of connection, yeah, doesn't really support that. Like people on average are they're just much more positive, much more generous, much more compassionate and understanding than we expect that they're going to be. And that it was kind of why writing that book was kind of transformative for me because it does make you, as you navigate the world, it makes it just feel a lot safer, a lot happier. Like it was really good for my well-being to have written that book for those reasons.
Mm. So, in a post-replication crisis world, what is your checklist for deciding a study is solid enough to include, and how do you avoid overpromising neat life hacks?
Yeah, I mean that it's my favorite question of all of them actually, because it's something that has really I did a lot of soul searching early on in my career over this because I kind of started my career in journalism like just as the replication crisis was kicking off. So it was quite fascinating to report on that. And there was a kind of period, I guess, a few years after that where it felt like every psychology result that I reported on, I had this anxiety, like, is this going to be the next one that's going to fall? So at that point, what I was looking for really was, well, has it been replicated? Like, is there a body of research? And it's not a guarantee, but I mean, it's much better than just basing what you're writing on a single study. And like I said earlier, I think it's all about, do you have multiple lines of evidence that all point in the same direction? So, you can like say something like the effects of loneliness on health. Well, something that's so convincing about that is the fact that you can have multiple measures of loneliness. You can ask people to list their friends, or you can ask them to just say subjectively, like how lonely did they feel or how supported did they feel. But what you found was that the measure didn't really matter. Like in all cases, you were seeing the same results. So, that kind of replication where you're using multiple methods, multiple samples, I find um, that in itself can be very convincing. But really, I do also prefer to see the randomized trials if I can with much bigger samples, and that's something that I've noticed. So even the difference between writing the laws of connection compared to the intelligence trap, like so many social psychologists now are replicating results for themselves. So they're already using big samples within their papers, and then they're performing a replication study within the paper itself. So that's already creating a much more statistically robust finding once they've done that. So for me today, if I'm reporting on new research, that's the kind of gold standard. There's a process that can be used called pre-registration, which is by no means perfect. It's not this kind of panacea, but that is where researchers will they'll kind of declare upfront, what experiment they're going to do, what their hypotheses are, and how they're going to test it. And what that prevents is that process of p-hacking, which is just where they were in the past, researchers, often without realizing what they were doing. They were kind of fudging the results a bit by using multiple analyses, changing like what they were testing, the hypothesis they were testing as they went along to kind of make sure they got a significant result. And with pre-registration, you make that impossible because you've already declared exactly what you're going to do, and you have to stick to that. So yeah, those are the kind of major criteria. I think it would be replication with lots of different methods, and then it would be large sample sizes, preferably with replications in the paper and with pre-registration.
Mhm. And lastly, we ask all of our interviewees, how do you define success personally and professionally?
Yeah, yeah, good question. Yeah, so something that like from all of the psychology that I've read, like I think like what we often forget to do is just to define like what our values are, like what things really matter to us. And so I would say a successful life and a meaningful life is really making sure that whatever you're doing is aligned with those values. And that will be different for different people, but it's kind of being conscious and mindful of that you're kind of that whatever achievements you decide to devote yourself to, that they align with those kind of core values of what you appreciate to be um, to be central to who you are. For me, I'm not, I mean, I absolutely, I'm not one of those people who would like turn down the opportunity to get like super rich or, for material goods, but like that hasn't been my motivation. And for me, like success really is um, kind of being able to learn new stuff, to kind of to develop as a writer. So I want each book that I write to be better than the last one. And in general life, I think it is social connection. So just making sure that I'm surrounding myself with people who I can have an authentic, genuine relationship with, where it's kind of reciprocal, mutually supportive.
Thank you so much. That's all I've had for now, except I really do think that everything I've done in the interview club and in other things that I've done is very much centered around what I didn't really have a name for it until now, but the being sure of yourself and having that confidence, and also recognizing that people are willing to help and that they're going to be much kinder, and you can email whoever you want and that they might respond and say yes, and that you can ask and see what happens.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. If you don't ask, you're going to fail, basically. Yeah.
And it's really hard to actually so I have a lot of other interviewers at a bunch of schools, and it's hard to even for them to send an email. In terms of, I tell them you can email anybody in the world, and they're almost so this past Thursday, just as a testament to how just crazy that's been the most eye-opening thing about the club. Is so originally it was a pairing for my investment analysis um club, and we just wanted to have some interviews with financial analysts and things like that. And I interviewed this guy who was just a very run-of-the-mill. He worked at Goldman Sachs, but he was nothing crazy huge. And then he recommended me to one of his friends, and then I think it was one of within my first 10 interviews, I was interviewing and completely unrelated from anything parent related or something like that. Was interviewing a multi-billionaire. He is on the board of Meta, and he's a crazy philanthropist in the city. He was the youngest billionaire in 2008 or something like that. And it was just crazy to see how, and that's, we renamed it from, I think it was Texan Talk or something like that, to Six Degrees, based on the six degrees of connection.
Yeah.
to just show how or like this past Thursday or a week ago, let's say, I was talking to my history teacher and she was like, "Oh, we're studying the or my sister's history teacher. Oh, we're studying the Cold War. I see you do these interviews. I'd be interested in just speaking with someone." So I went to Google and I looked up who's the best Cold War historian. And it says, "Oh, John Lewis Gaddis is the best historian. He has a Pulitzer Prize. He is at Yale for 20 years. He created all these things." So I emailed him, and then last Thursday we just had a interview with the whole class, and it's just crazy to see how all these incredibly successful people are so willing to give time, not even just for even an hour-long interview, but to oh like my financial literacy course is with a Berkeley professor, or I'm writing a paper with mentorship from this guy who is the head of all of risk and quantitative analysis for Goldman Sachs for 20 years. And it just all that I've done is just email people and be open-minded to the fact that they might respond.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that I have, and I emailed them at the start. I was just emailing, "I want to interview you." No previous interviews, no website even. Just I want to speak with you. They all say yes, for sure. Here, contact my secretary. And that was the most eye-opening experience surrounding
Yeah.
the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd have to say your email was great. So I get, a lot of these requests, but yours was like the ideal kind of interview request. Because, I mean, like you gave a lot of information about, what the project was, like what you hope to achieve from it. It was specific to me, because sometimes I just see these kind of cut and paste jobs where they don't even mention my book, or they don't even say like why they want to talk to me basically. Whereas I knew from your first email that it was going to be a good conversation basically, and then it's played out like that. Like you were super well prepared. It was um like you'd just done your research up front, and I think that's something that like we really appreciate when we're when you're having these requests, is just knowing that someone is going to make sure that it's an interesting and good chat basically. So I'm not surprised that so many people are responding positively, because I think you've got a great approach to do that.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. And also, just as an extra thing, it seems like, just from what I've picked up, it seems like once people help you a little bit, they want to help you even more. Once they've like sort of invested the time, then they're ready to go. Anything that you'd like, they're sort of willing to help. Are there any studies about that you know of, or something like that?
Yeah, a little bit. So there's this kind of concept called am I, which is like this Japanese concept, but I'm probably mispronouncing it. But it's like this idea that once you ask someone to help you, the act of helping you kind of makes them like you more. And like you said, I think it's partly because they've invested a little bit in it already, so they want to kind of make sure that that investment kind of pays off by making sure that you have the best experience you can. And I also just think it's that sense of connection. It's like once you've kind of had a few good emails with someone, you know that they're kind of acting in good faith, that they're genuinely curious. Then it's more like helping, I don't know, like a friend or a colleague you've known for a while. So it doesn't feel like a chore anymore. It just feels like something positive because it's for a good connection. So yeah, I think you're totally right. It's like, it can grow quite rapidly actually, and people, again, they're just much more generous than you expect them to be.